The United States of America has a lot of things. One of those things is a free market, usually. The government is relatively hands-off in the affairs of businesses and the private sector as a whole, but that hasn't always been the case. Probably the most famous example, and one most Americans use on a daily basis, the Postal Service. The USPS, you love them, you hate them, and they drive vans made by the same people who created the F-14 Tomcat. A postal service was envisioned as part of the government before the United States even existed, with the framers of the Constitution specifically giving Congress the authority and duty to establish post offices and post roads. This concern and involvement grew out of colonial-era frustrations with the British Royal Mail, which was highly censored and would often refuse to deliver things they deemed inappropriate. These considerations would result in the Postal Service Act of 1792, creating the United States Post Office Department. This act also established many of the extensive protections mail has in the United States, such as making it a crime to open another person's mail. The post office was given the objective to bind the nation together through the personal, educational, literary, and business correspondence of the people. This entity was tied closely to the federal government as an executive department, and Postmaster General became a position in the president's cabinet. The post office was generally financially self-sufficient for the first half-century or so of its existence, but it was threatened by competition from private courier services. Competitors were using railroads and steamboats to make deliveries quicker, and this loss of business would necessitate a taxpayer-funded bailout for the post office. To reduce competition and prevent this from becoming a problem in the future, Congress gave the post office a total monopoly on letter carrying in 1851 and set aside yearly federal funding. These measures would see the department through another half-century of service, but new issues would arise mainly due to this enforced monopoly. The expansion of the highly dispersed rural population in the West starting in the late 1800s would put great strain on the Postal Service. There was a universal service obligation to deliver mail to every American, but keeping up with a growing, remote, and rural population in much of the country was extremely difficult, especially with the technology of the time. By 1914, the post office had a deficit of $40 million, equivalent to $1.2 billion today, from rural delivery services. Congress again provided a bailout to make up the difference. By the 1960s, however, the Postal Service was becoming increasingly costly and inefficient, and Congress was unwilling to spend even more money. Wages demanded by postal workers were increasing sharply, and attempts to cut hours resulted in a months-long backlog of mail nationwide. So, in 1968, a presidential commission was created to study how to fix the post office. The report came back that the post office would be better off if it was run as a business rather than a service. This would result in the Postal Reorganization Act, which was controversial to say the least. Postal workers engaged in an 8-day strike across the country, which had a great deal of public support despite the lack of service caused by this disruption. Eventually, though, the government and the labor union struck a deal. In exchange for significant raises and increased bargaining rights, the postal union would support the restructuring. Nixon signed the Postal Reorganization Act shortly after, creating the United States Postal Service we know today. Although it remained part of the government, it was expected to function as a business and be generally self-sufficient as pertaining to funding. This has been largely achieved, and the organization has not received any funding from taxpayers since 1982. The USPS is a fairly unique organization. It's not quite a business, and it isn't exactly a government agency. The USPS remains technically a part of the executive branch, but it is run by a board of governors. It is also exempt from many of the laws that govern business and traditional commerce in the country. In 2004, a case was brought before the Supreme Court where it would have to be decided if the USPS was subject to antitrust laws. The court decided it wasn't, describing the USPS as a public business and a government corporation. The USPS is very much beholden to the will of the government, such as when the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act was passed in 2006. This limited the services the USPS could provide, now defining postal services as only carrying packages and letters. Strangely, this law also mandated that the post office set aside pension funds for employees they would have to hire in the future. No other entity, be it a private business or a government agency, is under any requirement like this. Just after placing this huge financial burden on the USPS, which made them lose $5 billion overnight, the government added another stipulation. The USPS also has no ability to set prices for its services. All prices for USPS services and products are tied to the Consumer Price Index and cannot rise higher than the rate of inflation. Combine this with the obligation to provide service to every American, and the constant financial woes of the Postal Service becomes more understandable. It's hard to say how much of these problems come from the strange government hybrid model of the modern USPS. First-class mail volume, the biggest source of revenue for the organization, has been steadily and significantly dropping for some time now. The USPS also has significant debt, about 226% of the average annual revenue's worth. For most government entities, this wouldn't really be a problem since they have many options to handle debt and costs like this. But, as the Government Accountability Office puts it, there is no consensus on what USPS's level of financial self-sustainability should be. The GAO also looked into a potential bankruptcy filing for the USPS as a way to free itself from these financial burdens it has accumulated. This would indeed be an option for most entities, but there is a very strange bureaucratic issue. Being a government entity, it cannot file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, that's only for businesses. However, Chapter 9 bankruptcy for financially distressed government institutions is also off the table since the USPS is not under the jurisdiction of any specific state or municipality. Even if it did get a bankruptcy, however, most of the Postal Service's financial problems come from laws imposed on it, so it would be unlikely to solve its issues. The Postal Service wasn't the only time the federal government decided to build a corporation for the sake of advancing the nation. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s saw some of the most sweeping government involvement in the private sector in American history, primarily for the sake of combating the Great Depression. Infrastructure projects were a big part of this, and some of the most impactful were spearheaded by the Tennessee Valley Authority. The TVA was created in 1933 by the aptly named Tennessee Valley Authority Act, though its history goes back a couple decades prior. In 1916, the federal government funded a hydroelectric dam in the town of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. This was intended to provide electricity for a munitions plant during World War I, but the war ended before it could be completed. The dam languished in an incomplete state for a decade, as the government debated between selling it off to a private utility company or maintaining federal control. A bill in 1931 would have resolved the issue, allocating the resources to bring it online as a government utility, but this was vetoed by President Herbert Hoover. The idea wasn't dead for long, though, as in 1933, FDR signed the aforementioned TVA Act, with the dam being its first facility. The act specifically created the company with the goal of developing the Tennessee River and expanding agriculture and commerce in the region, primarily through improving access to electricity. But why the Tennessee Valley? This is an unusual treatment for a random region of the country, right? The South has, for most of American history, been a relatively impoverished region. The wealth found here is significant, but it is found in the soil and agriculture of the area, not in the mines and the factories that led to urbanization in the rest of the country. Thus, the South, even today, is largely rural and agricultural. 100 years ago, it was even more rural. In the southern United States in the 1930s, yearly income was half of the national average, and only 10% of homes had electricity. Malaria was rampant, and infrastructure in general was in a poor state or simply didn't exist. Private utility companies were the ones building the vast majority of American infrastructure at this time, and they simply didn't see a reason to do business in this region where there wasn't much money. It took the TVA to finally build infrastructure here. In 1934, there were 0 miles of new power lines being built in the region. Between 1938 and 1942, however, an average of 5,000 miles were being built per year. By 1939, the percentage of farms with electricity had gone from 3% to 50% thanks to the TVA's efforts. The TVA built dams and infrastructure, but their work extended into non-electricity development efforts too. Combating diseases, some of them the biggest killers in the South at the time, was a priority. New dams reduced mosquito populations, curbing rampant malaria. Typhoid shots were made mandatory for all TVA employees, and in partnership with county health departments were offered to the public at TVA facilities. By 1951, the TVA had also given over 500,000 smallpox shots. The company had the tall order of developing the region, but at the end of the day, it was a utility company. Many in rural areas didn't really know what they could use electricity for, and so it partnered with the federal government to create the Electric Home and Farm Authority. This group would send out trucks with various electric home appliances, and students from local technical colleges would demonstrate the uses of them to people in rural communities. As the TVA moved through the region, building new roads, power lines, and railroads, they also brought hospitals, newspapers, and post offices. The company became one of the first major sources of books, from both bookstores and libraries, but also bookmobiles that would distribute them in remote areas. By the end of the 1930s, the TVA was distributing more than 13,000 books a month. As if the duties of a power company couldn't get broader, the TVA also had to develop agriculture and farms in the region. Thousands of demonstration farms were set up to show farmers the benefits and proper applications of modern fertilizers. The company developed new kinds of fertilizers themselves, too, at a research center in Muscle Shoals. The TVA soon became one of the biggest producers of fertilizer, accounting for 25% of national production between 1934 and 1955. TVA fertilizer has been used in 47 states and is responsible for at least a third of U.S. crop production. The TVA's purpose at the end of the day, of course, has been to provide electricity, as it did during World War II. For the sake of fueling American industry, the TVA managed to build 10 dams from 1942 to 1945 at a record-breaking pace. A good chunk of this electricity went to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of the facilities tasked with building an atomic bomb. The project was kept so secret that not even the president of the TVA knew what they needed all this electricity for, but nonetheless, the company supplied all the power needed for Oak Ridge and the myriad factories that had sprung up in the region. The TVA, for all of its accomplishments, has had some controversies in its past. In 1939, shortly after its founding, a case challenging the legality of its mere existence went all the way to the Supreme Court. Wendell Willkie, legal counsel for the rival utility company Commonwealth and Southern, as well as the eventual 1940 Republican presidential candidate, brought the suit. The argument was that the government selling electricity was an infringement on the property rights of private utility companies. The Supreme Court dismissed this, however, citing that there's nothing illegal about a new company competing in an industry, even if it is owned by the government. They also point out how the TVA had more responsibilities than just providing power. Today, the TVA is still around and is one of the largest utility companies in the country. The company owns 30 dams, 3 nuclear plants, and controversially, a few coal plants too. In 2008, an embankment at the Kingston fossil plant failed, spilling approximately 5.4 million cubic yards of coal ash into the surrounding area and rivers. It was the largest coal spill in U.S. history and immediately became an EPA Superfund site. The accident devastated local ecosystems and killed a large number of fish. The cleanup effort was lengthy, not being completed until 2015 and costing over $1.3 billion. No company is completely without controversy, of course, but probably the most controversial American state-owned company is UNICOR. UNICOR? That name gives you pretty much no information, right? Well, that's the trade name for Federal Prison Industries, a company run by the Bureau of Prisons. It does exactly what it sounds like. It's the company that organizes and runs prison labor in the country. UNICOR, like the TVA, was one of FDR's creations. Before the federalization of America's prison system in 1930, prisons were able to organize inmate labor independently and essentially do it however they wanted. This was criticized by both the left and the right. On the left, the poor working conditions, long hours, and low pay was slammed as mistreatment of workers. On the right, prison labor was seen as taking jobs away from law-abiding citizens and unfair competition with private businesses. This debate went on until 1934, when FDR signed an executive order establishing UNICOR. With the Great Depression at its height, paying to have prisoners sit idle was seen as unacceptable. It was created with the goal of providing inmates with skills while incarcerated, and also to diversify prison labor enough that no particular industry would be substantially affected. UNICOR's operations are split into 6 rough industries or categories. These are clothing and textiles, electronics, industrial products, office furniture, recycling, and services, which primarily encompasses data entry. UNICOR is perhaps one of the strangest government-run companies, especially in relation to how it interacts with private business. Federal regulations require that all government entities attempt to source their needed material from UNICOR first before they can try to find another source in the private sector. If UNICOR has the product available, it meets the agency's required quality standards, and can be delivered in a reasonable time frame, government agencies are required by law to purchase from them. You can actually go on their website and see all the products they make. It's quite a list. A quirk of this requirement is that UNICOR doesn't actually make all that much per se. Much of what UNICOR does these days is put the final touches on nearly finished products to fulfill the sourcing requirement. Of course, that's just the private sector's main gripe with UNICOR, how they snap up a good chunk of government procurement. The much more generally controversial part is the whole, prison labor thing. Currently, all inmates who are physically able to and that do not pose a security threat are required to work. Of the little over 1 million eligible incarcerated people in the United States, 53% have a work assignment. In total, 7% of inmates work for UNICOR. The wages earned by inmates for their work varies quite a bit by state and education level, but generally falls somewhere between 25 cents an hour to $2 an hour. On average, those that work for prison industries, like in UNICOR, earn an average of $1.40 an hour. There are additional financial restrictions on what inmates can do with this money. Those who have court-ordered financial obligations, for example, must use at least 50% of their work program income to pay off their debts. The amount of inmates working for UNICOR has been steadily dropping since the mid-2000s, and UNICOR employees as a percentage of the total prison population has been declining since the 90s. Currently, around 10,000 inmates work for UNICOR. One of the main arguments in favor of prison labor in general is that it reduces recidivism and helps inmates find jobs when they are released from prison. Studies have been done on this, though not very many, and their methodology is questionable due to sampling biases. Generally, though, it does seem that participating in prison labor programs reduces chances of rearrest and increases chances inmates will find jobs after release, with prisoners with lower education levels benefiting the most. UNICOR's overall financials are in a weird place, with many regulations on how they're allowed to spend money. Firstly, UNICOR is barred from receiving any federal funds and has never received any. UNICOR is also required to reinvest any money it makes back into itself, for the sake of paying wages, purchasing raw materials, expanding facilities, and the like. All money that UNICOR makes is put into a special independent fund, unlike most agencies which have to give extra funds to the Treasury. To be clear though, UNICOR and these restrictions are only in federal prisons, the ones operated by the Bureau of Prisons. Prisons run by individual states have no such regulations and can essentially run their labor programs however they wish. Every state except Alaska has some sort of separate prison industry system. Most of these are still only allowed to sell to government entities, but a few allow prisoners to work for completely private organizations. UNICOR exists because the United States never fully decide whether prisoners are workers, wards of the state, or something else entirely. And so, it persists as a company that is too commercial to be a rehabilitation program, too coercive to be a job, and too politically entrenched to disappear. Any attempts at significant reform seem distant. Prison labor reform is often perceived as being soft on crime, which is electorally toxic enough that most politicians simply avoid the topic. A much less controversial company is the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If you're an American, you've probably seen FDIC insured on your bank's website, or maybe you've heard it in a commercial. The FDIC is yet another one of FDR's Great Depression-era national revitalization projects. Between the market crash of 1929 to early 1933, banking in the United States had essentially stopped altogether. 9,000 banks had closed, with $1.3 billion in deposited funds being lost, or about $32 billion in today's money. The situation was so bad that FDR ordered a temporary stop to all banking activity to avoid a total loss of deposited funds. Even before the Depression, however, from 1921 to 1929, on average, 600 banks a year failed, with no recourse for people who had money deposited with them. Many were already upset with the banks before the crisis of 1929. So, to restore faith in whatever ruins of the banking system were left, the Banking Act of 1933 was passed. This created the FDIC, initially meant to only be a temporary agency. It had the goal of ensuring the money of most depositors at participating banks and reducing the disruption bank failures have on the economy overall. Its creation was debated at first. Many in the banking industry criticized it as being too costly and subsidizing banks that are poorly run. The opinion of the general public, however, was firmly behind the idea. Some states had previously run their own bank insurance programs, but by the early 1930s, all of these had shut down. So, it was up to the FDIC to step in, initially insuring deposits at participating banks up to $2,500. The effect this had was immediate. Bank runs, people hurriedly trying to pull their money out of banks for fear of losing it during economic uncertainty, stopped almost entirely. The pressure of nervous depositors being eased meant less banks failed too, as bank runs were often the very cause of their failures. In 1934, a year after the FDIC's creation, only 9 banks failed. Between 1934 and 1941, the FDIC dealt with a total of 370 bank failures, mainly of small, local banks. A pretty high number by modern standards, of course, but it's worth remembering that this was still the Great Depression and the number would have been a lot higher without the FDIC. Later, from 1942 to 1945, with World War II in full swing and the strange time this was for the banking world, only 28 banks failed. The war saw a huge expansion in banking activity as they began lending out huge amounts of money to support the war effort. Assets held by banks more than doubled during the war period. After the war, many were concerned that banks would begin to fail again, as capital-to-asset ratios for these banks had declined sharply, generally something that causes instability in the banking world. But this fear didn't materialize, and the explosive consumer demand of the 1950s made up for the shortfall from the war's conclusion. The lending that banks had been doing with the government simply shifted to civilian consumers. Bank failures in this time were so rare that it prompted House Banking Chairman Wright Patman to comment that the government had actually gone too far in ensuring bank safety. This was mainly caused by the still relatively conservative loaning practices of banks at the time. The memory of the Great Depression left a scar in the banking world, one that wouldn't fade until the 60s. Banks began offering large certificates of deposits, increasing their reliance on purchased money. Individual bank branches were given much more autonomy in how they chose to run things, allowing many to expand into new markets and offer new kinds of services. Large banks were suddenly in a rather fierce competition to offer more services to more people, pushing them to take greater and greater risks. This generally didn't cause any issues until the 1970s, specifically not until the 1973 oil embargo. In response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil-producing countries imposed an oil embargo, causing oil prices globally to surge. This had an effect that rippled through the economy, and especially relevant for banks, sharply increased inflation and interest rates. By the late 70s, many banks were struggling to keep up with interest rates offered elsewhere. The interest rates banks could offer on savings accounts were being kept artificially low by the government, and many people and companies began pulling funds out of banks as a result. In 1976, the FDIC handled 16 bank failures, the highest number since 1940. The company also handled its first truly large bank failure, that being the Franklin National Bank. It was the country's 20th largest bank at the time, with $3.6 billion worth of assets. The bank had invested heavily in municipal bonds, which became low-yielding and uncompetitive when interest rates shot up. Investors took their money elsewhere, and the bank and its 108 branches went under. It took about 6 months for the FDIC to handle the case. They were able to find a buyer for most of the bank's assets, that being the European American Bank, and the matter was settled fairly cleanly without any loss to depositors. The deposit insurance part of the FDIC's name is a bit confusing because it doesn't really function like normal insurance where they compensate people for a loss they suffered. In practice, the FDIC usually resolves bank failures by arranging a purchase and assumption transaction in which another bank takes over the failed bank's deposits and assets, allowing depositors to retain uninterrupted access to their funds. Financial difficulties continued into the early 80s, with 18 of the 25 largest bank failures in the FDIC's history happening in this period. One of these was the Penn Square Bank, a long-beleaguered bank in Oklahoma. The bank eventually failed in 1982, and its financials were in such a confusing state and there were so many lawsuits pending against it, the FDIC opted to pay out $250 million instead of finding someone to purchase it. But some money was lost, an unknown amount. This was a deliberate decision by the FDIC. It was an attempt to show large banks that they were not fully covered and insured and encourage market discipline. Penn Square's failure had far-reaching effects, though. They had been an aggressive lender, and many of these loans were of extremely poor quality. So, when the bank failed, other banks that held loan participations were suddenly in deep trouble too. One of these was the Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago. Continental had taken billions of dollars worth of troubled assets like this, and the failure of Penn made companies that had funds with them suddenly want to take that money out. The bank was FDIC insured, yes, but the FDIC is meant to protect ordinary individual customers, so only $100,000 worth of funds per depositor were insured. Any amount beyond that was completely uninsured. Had Continental been a small bank, there likely wouldn't have been an intervention, the bank simply would have failed. But Continental wasn't small, it was a huge bank, and would have caused a crisis if it failed. So, in 1984, regulators made the decision that the bank was too big to fail, saying that some banks are just so crucial to the financial system that they cannot be allowed to collapse. The government intervened, insuring all deposits, and effectively nationalized the bank for about a decade before ultimately being sold off to Bank of America. And that's sort of been the FDIC's job since, managing bailouts for big banks. The next big events in its history are during the 2008 financial crisis, and yeah, they bailed out banks, that's what they did. The thing they didn't want to do for fear of encouraging bad behavior in the finance sector has become de facto their main line of work. The FDIC's role is still important, of course, and you won't see me doing any bank at a place not insured by them, but still. For a company created to protect ordinary depositors, it's striking how much of its job nowadays is protecting banks from the consequences of their own actions. I hope this has been an interesting look at a strange part of the American economy and government. The United States is a capitalist country, but there is also no such thing as a pure market economy, as we have seen. The government has decided that some industries and services cannot be left up to the market. Whether that is a contradiction in the system, or simply how modern capitalism actually works, is an open question.
This is a CPTA announcement test. I don't know what it's supposed to say. I'm not really that concerned with it. So if anyone gets this, just disregard it. Okay, and hang up.